Family only, my daughter-in-law said as she stepped in front of the doorway. And in that moment, I realized the house I helped pay for had become the one place I was no longer welcome. I stood on the front porch holding a gift basket wrapped with a blue ribbon. Inside were homemade cookies, a framed family photo, and a handwritten note wishing them happiness in their new home. The late afternoon sun reflected off the tall windows behind Brooke, making it difficult to see the faces gathered inside. But I could hear them laughing. I could hear music. I could hear the celebration. What I could not do was walk through the front door. My name is Patricia Reynolds. I am 68 years old, and 3 months earlier I had written the largest check of my life to help my son buy the house of his dreams. At least, that was what I thought I was doing. Brooke crossed her arms and offered an uncomfortable smile. It is just a small gathering, she said. Mostly immediate family. For a second, I wondered if I had misheard her. Immediate family. The words echoed in my mind. My son Ethan was standing only a few feet behind her. Our eyes met briefly. I waited for him to say something. Anything. A laugh. A correction. An invitation to come inside. Instead, he looked away. That hurt more than Brooke's words ever could. The driveway was filled with cars. I recognized several of them. Brooke's parents were there. Her brother was there. Even a few neighbors I had never met were carrying plates of food into the backyard. Immediate family, apparently, meant everyone except me. I tightened my grip on the gift basket and forced a smile. I understand, I said quietly. Brooke nodded as if we had reached a reasonable agreement. Then the front door slowly closed. I remained standing on the porch for several seconds. The basket suddenly felt heavier than it had when I carried it from my car. Behind the door, the laughter continued. Nobody came back outside. Nobody called my name. Eventually, I walked back to my car and placed the basket on the passenger seat. As I started the engine, I looked once more at the house. It was beautiful. A large 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch. Ethan had fallen in love with it the moment he saw it. I remembered the excitement in his voice when he first showed me the listing. I remembered him saying they were just a little short of the down payment. I remembered the tears in his eyes when I told him I could help. My late husband and I had spent decades saving carefully. We skipped vacations. We delayed purchases. We planned for retirement. After he passed away, those savings became my security. Yet when Ethan asked for help, I never hesitated. That was what parents did. Or at least that was what I believed. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes. The entire time, I kept replaying the scene in my head. Family only. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had disappeared below the horizon. I sat in my car for a long moment before reaching for my phone. That was when I noticed a new photo posted online less than 10 minutes earlier. It showed everyone gathered together in the living room of the new house. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was holding a glass in celebration. Above the photo was a caption written by Brooke. Our family, finally home. I stared at the photo for a long time. The screen of my phone dimmed twice before I finally touched it again. There they were. Ethan standing beside Brooke with his arm around her shoulders. Brooke's parents smiling proudly near the fireplace. Her brother holding a drink and laughing at something outside the frame. Even the neighbors were there. The living room glowed with warm light. The house looked exactly the way Ethan had dreamed it would look. Comfortable. Welcoming. Full of people. Yet somehow the woman who helped make it possible was missing from every corner of that image. I enlarged the photo and studied each face. Not because I was angry. Not yet. Because I was trying to understand. Trying to find some explanation that would make sense of what happened on that porch. But every time I looked at the picture, I noticed the same thing. Nobody seemed surprised that I was not there. Nobody looked like they were wondering where I had gone. It was as if my absence had been expected all along. I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen. The house felt unusually quiet. Ever since my husband passed away 5 years earlier, I had learned how to live with silence. Most evenings were simple. A cup of tea, a television program, a good book before bed. Usually I found comfort in the routine. That night the silence felt different. Heavier somehow. I opened the refrigerator and noticed a container of potato salad I had prepared for the housewarming party. Brooke loved that recipe. Or at least she used to. I remembered her asking for it during family gatherings. I remembered making extra portions for her to take home. Standing there in the kitchen, I suddenly realized how many memories involved me giving something. Time, money, support, encouragement. I sat down at the table and found myself thinking about the day Ethan first told me about the house. He had arrived carrying a folder full of listing photos. His excitement filled the room. He talked about the schools nearby, the backyard, the extra bedroom they hoped to use one day for children. I still remembered the way his voice cracked when he admitted they did not have enough for the down payment. He looked embarrassed, even bringing it up. I had reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Families help each other, I told him. At the time, I believed those words completely. My husband and I spent decades teaching Ethan that family showed up for one another. We helped when someone struggled. We celebrated when someone succeeded. We stayed connected no matter what. Around midnight, I picked up my phone one last time before bed. That was when I noticed another post. Brooke had uploaded several additional photos from the evening. One image stopped me cold. It showed the wall above the fireplace. Hanging there in a beautiful silver frame was a family portrait taken just 6 months earlier. Everyone was included. Ethan, Brooke, Brooke's parents, her brother, even the family dog. Everyone except me. I stared at that picture until my eyes began to sting. Then a troubling thought entered my mind. Maybe what happened on the porch was not a sudden decision. Maybe it had been planned long before I ever arrived. The next morning, I could not stop thinking about the photograph above the fireplace. Out of all the things that happened, that image stayed with me the most. Not because I expected to be the center of attention. I never had. What troubled me was the deliberate nature of it. Family photographs do not appear by accident. Someone chooses them. Someone frames them. Someone hangs them on the wall for every visitor to see. And someone had made the decision that I did not belong in theirs. I spent the morning sorting through old photo albums stored in the hallway closet. At first, I told myself I was simply organizing. In truth, I was searching for answers. The albums covered decades of family history. Ethan's first birthday, school concerts, camping trips, Christmas mornings. Every milestone seemed to include one constant detail. I was always there. Not because I demanded attention, because I showed up. Through every success and every disappointment, I showed up. Around lunchtime, I found an album from 8 years earlier. It contained photographs from the day Ethan graduated from a professional certification program that helped launch his career. I remembered paying for the tuition when money was tight. He had promised to pay me back one day. I never expected him to. Watching him succeed had been enough. As I turned the pages, another memory surfaced. 3 years ago, Ethan and Brooke had struggled after purchasing a small investment property. Unexpected repairs drained their savings. I quietly wrote a check to help them recover. Before that, there had been medical bills. Before that, a car repair. Before that, help with rent during a difficult period. None of those moments felt important at the time. They were simply what family did for one another. Yet as the memories accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. Every time Ethan faced a challenge, I stepped forward. Every time he needed help, I found a way. The strange part was that I could remember dozens of occasions when I supported him. I struggled to remember the last time he asked what I needed. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He talked about the house, the neighborhood, a new grill he had purchased for the backyard. Nearly 10 minutes passed before either of us mentioned the previous evening. Sorry, things were a little crowded yesterday, he said casually. Crowded. That was the explanation. Not an apology. Not confusion. Not regret. Just crowded. I looked around my quiet kitchen and felt something shift inside me. I see, I replied. Ethan quickly changed the subject. By the end of the conversation, he sounded relieved, as though he believed the matter had been settled. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I opened social media again. Another new photo had appeared. This one showed Brooke standing proudly in front of a decorative shelf in the living room. Family pictures surrounded her. Brooke's parents, Brooke's brother, friends, neighbors. Everyone seemed to have a place in that house. Everyone except me. Then I noticed something else. Sitting on the shelf beside the photographs was a silver picture frame I recognized immediately. I had purchased it as a housewarming gift nearly 2 weeks earlier and given it to Ethan before moving day. Suddenly, a troubling realization settled over me. They had accepted everything I gave them. The money, the gifts, the support, the sacrifices. What they no longer seemed willing to accept was me. That evening, I could not stop thinking about the silver picture frame. It was a small thing, just a simple gift purchased during an afternoon shopping trip. Yet somehow it felt symbolic. They had found a place for the frame. They simply had not found a place for the person who gave it to them. The thought followed me throughout the night. The next morning, I decided to sort through some old financial records stored in a filing cabinet near my bedroom. It was not something I normally enjoyed doing. My late husband, Richard, had always been the organized one. Every document had a folder. Every folder had a label. After he passed away, I tried my best to maintain his system. Most of the time it worked. Sometimes it felt like I was preserving a small piece of him. As I opened drawer after drawer, I came across years of paperwork, tax returns, insurance statements, mortgage documents from the house where I still lived. Then I found a thick folder labeled Family Assistance. The handwriting belonged to Richard. Curious, I carried the folder to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were copies of checks, notes, and records stretching back more than a decade. I slowly turned the pages. There was the money we helped Ethan with during graduate school. There was assistance for a medical emergency several years later. There were records connected to the investment property that nearly drained their savings. Each page represented a moment when Richard and I stepped in because family mattered more than finances. Then I reached a section I had not seen before. The documents related directly to the new house. Copies of bank transfers, correspondence, legal paperwork. I studied the numbers carefully. The amount was even larger than I remembered. My husband had insisted we keep detailed records whenever significant money changed hands. At the time, I viewed it as one of his many habits. Looking at the folder now, I felt grateful for it. Near the back of the file was something unexpected. A sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. My heart skipped. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a short letter. Richard explained that he had assembled the folder in case questions ever arose regarding family finances. The letter was practical, exactly the way he approached most things in life. Then I reached a paragraph that made me stop reading. He wrote that generosity should never require someone to surrender their dignity. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Somehow it felt as though he were speaking directly to me from years earlier. Richard continued by explaining that when large amounts of money become involved, people sometimes reveal sides of themselves they never intended others to see. Not because they are evil, because pressure changes priorities. The words lingered in my mind long after I finished reading. Later that afternoon, I called the number written at the bottom of the letter. It belonged to Samuel Carter, the attorney who had handled many of Richard's legal matters over the years. We had not spoken since the funeral. Samuel sounded pleased to hear from me. After a brief conversation, he asked an unexpected question. "Patricia, have Ethan and Brooke mentioned anything unusual regarding the house?" I looked down at the folder resting on my kitchen table. Suddenly, the feeling that something was wrong became much harder to ignore. Then Samuel said something that made my stomach tighten. "There are a few documents your husband wanted reviewed if certain situations ever developed. I think it may be time for us to meet." The following morning, I drove to Samuel Carter's office carrying the folder Richard had assembled years earlier. The building looked exactly as I remembered it. Brick exterior, small reception area, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the hallway. Samuel greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. As soon as we sat down, he noticed the folder in my hands. His expression grew serious. "I was hoping you found that," he said quietly. For the next hour, we reviewed documents together. Some I recognized, others I had never seen before. Richard had been thorough, more thorough than I realized. Samuel explained that my husband occasionally worried about what might happen if significant financial assistance created misunderstandings later. He was not suspicious by nature. He was simply careful. According to Samuel, Richard believed generosity worked best when expectations were clearly documented. Then Samuel opened a separate file and removed several pages. "These are the documents I mentioned on the phone," he said. "I studied them carefully. They related directly to the money Ethan and Brooke received for the house. What surprised me was not the amount. It was the structure. Richard had insisted the funds be documented formally rather than treated as a casual gift. At the time, I barely paid attention to the paperwork. I trusted him completely. Now I wished I had paid closer attention. Samuel pointed to a section highlighted near the bottom of one page. The language was straightforward. Certain rights and protections remained attached to the funds under specific circumstances. Nothing unreasonable, nothing controlling. Simply safeguards designed to prevent misuse or misrepresentation. As I continued reading, a troubling question formed in my mind. Did Ethan know about this? Samuel nodded. Yes, both Ethan and Brooke signed the documents. I sat back in my chair. For several moments, I could not think of anything to say. If that was true, then neither of them could honestly claim ignorance. Samuel remained quiet, allowing me time to process what I had learned. Finally, he opened another file. Inside were notes from meetings Richard attended during the final years of his life. One entry immediately caught my attention. Richard had expressed concern about increasing financial pressure affecting Ethan and Brooke. There was no judgment in his comments, only concern. He worried that money problems might eventually influence important family decisions. Reading those notes felt strangely emotional. Even years later, Richard was still trying to protect the people he loved. Samuel folded his hands and looked at me carefully. There is something else you should know. My stomach tightened. He explained that several months before the house purchase, Ethan and Brooke had been dealing with financial difficulties far more serious than I realized. Business losses, debt obligations, missed expectations tied to an investment. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. The urgency, the pressure, the strange behavior. It did not excuse what happened on the porch, but it explained why the house seemed to matter so much. Before I left, Samuel handed me a sealed envelope bearing Richard's signature. He instructed me to give you this only if circumstances ever became complicated. I stared at the envelope for a long moment. Richard had been gone for 5 years. Yet somehow he was still reaching across time to help me understand what was happening. As I walked back to my car, I felt something changing inside me. The hurt was still there. So was the disappointment. But now there was something else. Clarity. And for the first time since that housewarming party, I realized there was a great deal about Ethan and Brooke's situation that I still did not know. When I arrived home, I placed the sealed envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for nearly an hour. The afternoon sunlight slowly moved across the room while I sat there thinking about everything Samuel had told me. Ethan and Brooke had been carrying financial problems far larger than I ever imagined. For years, I believed the house represented stability, a fresh start, a reward for hard work. Now I was beginning to wonder if it represented something else entirely. Eventually, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard. The sight of his handwriting immediately brought back memories of anniversary cards, grocery lists, and notes he used to leave beside the coffee maker before early business trips. For a moment, it felt as though he were sitting across from me again. The letter began simply. He wrote about family, about trust, about the importance of helping people when they needed it. Then the tone shifted. Richard explained that several months before the house purchase, he became aware that Ethan and Brooke were facing serious financial pressure. He never mentioned how he learned about it. He simply documented what he knew. A failed investment, mounting debt, deadlines that continued moving closer. As I continued reading, one sentence caught my attention immediately. Richard wrote that financial pressure often reveals what people value most. Not because it changes who they are, because it removes the luxury of pretending. I read that line twice, then a third time. The words lingered in my mind long after I finished the page. Richard continued by describing a conversation he overheard during a family gathering. Ethan and Brooke believed they were alone in the backyard. They were discussing the future. According to Richard, Ethan sounded worried. Brooke sounded frustrated. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "The house solves all of it," Brooke had said. I lowered the letter and stared out the window. The garden swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet suddenly, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The house solves all of it. Not the house feels like home. Not the house is perfect for our family. The house solves all of it. The words sounded less like a dream and more like a financial strategy. Richard's letter continued. He explained that while Ethan worried about debt, Brooke seemed focused on opportunity, property values, future equity, long-term financial leverage. The more I read, the more I began to understand the difference between them. Ethan appeared trapped by fear. Brooke appeared motivated by solutions. Unfortunately, those solutions seemed to involve treating relationships like assets. Over the next several days, I paid closer attention. Not because I wanted conflict, because I wanted clarity. Once I started looking, the signs became impossible to ignore. Brooke sent articles about downsizing. She mentioned retirement communities. She talked about simplifying life. Every conversation somehow returned to the same subject: the house, the property, the future. Then one evening, Ethan called unexpectedly. During the conversation, he casually mentioned how expensive homeownership had become. Property taxes, maintenance costs, insurance. His voice sounded tired, stressed. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with me long afterward. "Sometimes I wish things were simpler." It was an honest statement, perhaps the most honest thing he had said in months. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the darkened living room. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. The exclusion, the photographs, the strange conversations, the sudden distance. For the first time since the housewarming party, I realized this situation had never been about whether I belonged in the house. It was about what the house represented to them. And that realization made me wonder just how far they were willing to go to protect it. Over the next 2 weeks, I made a deliberate decision. I stopped asking questions. I stopped trying to understand their behavior. Most importantly, I stopped reacting. If Ethan and Brooke expected me to argue, I gave them silence. If they expected me to demand explanations, I gave them patience. The effect was immediate. The more accepting I appeared, the more comfortable they became. Ethan called occasionally. Our conversations remained polite, surface level, safe. Brooke became even more relaxed. She sent me links to retirement communities and articles about simplifying life after 65. Each message arrived wrapped in concern. Every suggestion sounded helpful. Yet by now, I understood the pattern. The recommendations were never really about my happiness. They were about making me smaller, easier to move, easier to remove. One Saturday afternoon, Brooke invited me to lunch. The invitation surprised me enough that I accepted. We met at a small restaurant near the new neighborhood. The atmosphere was pleasant. Families filled the tables around us. For a while, the conversation remained harmless. Weather, gardening, local events. Then, almost exactly as I expected, the discussion shifted toward the house. Brooke described upcoming renovations, landscaping plans, furniture purchases. The more she spoke, the more ownership filled her voice. Eventually, she leaned forward and lowered her tone. "You know, Patricia, there comes a point when holding on to the past becomes more difficult than embracing the future." I stirred my iced tea slowly. "Is that so?" She nodded. "The house is a lot of responsibility. I just worry about you living alone." There it was again, concern disguised as persuasion. I smiled politely and changed the subject. The rest of lunch passed without incident. Yet as we prepared to leave, something happened that stayed with me. Brooke stepped outside to answer a phone call. I was only a few feet away when I heard her voice. She did not realize I could hear her clearly. Most of the conversation sounded ordinary. Then one sentence stopped me cold. "The house solves everything if we can just keep things on track." My heart sank. Not because I learned something new, because I received confirmation. The house was never simply a home. It was a solution, a strategy, a financial answer to problems I still did not fully understand. That evening, I called Samuel. We spoke for nearly an hour. He listened carefully as I described the lunch conversation. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he said something that surprised me. "Patricia, I think they have become so focused on the property that they are forgetting the paperwork attached to it." The paperwork attached to it. The phrase lingered in my mind. Samuel explained that Richard had anticipated situations exactly like this. Not because he distrusted Ethan, because he understood human nature. Financial pressure can make intelligent people ignore important details. It can also make them underestimate other people. Before ending the call, Samuel asked me to meet him later that week. There were additional documents he wanted to review, documents connected to the original house transaction. After we hung up, I walked through my quiet home and switched off the lights one room at a time. The familiar routine calmed me. For the first time since the housewarming party, I no longer felt confused. The pieces were finally arranged clearly enough to see the full picture. Ethan and Brooke believed they were protecting their future. What they did not realize was that Richard had spent years protecting something far more important. And very soon, they were going to discover exactly what he had left behind. 3 days later, I met Samuel at his office once again. This time, the atmosphere felt different. More serious. More final. A thick stack of documents rested on the conference table between us, but there was also something else. A sealed envelope bearing Richard's handwriting. Samuel noticed me looking at it. "That comes later," he said quietly. "First, we need to review the paperwork." Ethan and Brooke arrived shortly afterward. Ethan looked exhausted. Brooke looked composed, though not nearly as confident as she once had. We took our seats around the table. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Samuel began walking everyone through the history of the house purchase. Dates, transfers, agreements, financial records. Every detail was documented. Every signature was accounted for. The further he progressed, the quieter the room became. Then Samuel reached the most important file. He explained that the money Richard and I provided was never intended to disappear into the background as a forgotten favor. It had been documented carefully and deliberately. Certain protections remained attached to it. Certain obligations remained active. Both Ethan and Brooke had acknowledged those conditions when they signed the paperwork. Samuel placed copies in front of them. Ethan stared at the pages. Brooke examined them silently. For the first time since this entire situation began, uncertainty appeared on her face. The confidence she carried for months seemed to fade a little more with every page she turned. Then Samuel reached for the sealed envelope. The room became completely silent. He opened it carefully and removed several sheets of paper. Richard instructed me to read this only if a situation like this ever occurred, he said. My heart tightened. Hearing Richard's words had never become easier. Samuel began reading. The letter spoke about family, about gratitude, about responsibility. Then it became more personal. A home should never become the place where gratitude is forgotten. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Samuel continued. Richard wrote that generosity was never meant to create debt. It was meant to create opportunity. But opportunity carried responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Moral responsibility. The room felt smaller somehow as the words filled it. Then Samuel unfolded another page. This one was addressed specifically to Ethan. Even Samuel seemed affected as he began reading. Ethan, if you are hearing this letter, it means something has gone wrong between the people I love most. Before you listen to anyone else, listen to this. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The greatest investment I ever made was not a house. It was my son. Money can disappear. Property can change hands. Markets rise and fall. But character is what remains when everything else is gone. Ethan stared at the table. His hands remained folded in front of him. Samuel continued reading. If life ever places you under pressure, do not solve your problems by forgetting who stood beside you when you had nothing. Your mother helped build your future long before this house existed. I felt my throat tighten. Across the table, Ethan blinked several times and looked away. Brooke sat unusually still. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Richard's final words were simple. Never confuse what you own with what truly matters. When Samuel finished reading, nobody spoke. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. Ethan remained seated for a long time, staring at the documents spread across the table. The house, the money, the agreements. None of it seemed to matter in that moment, because the truth Richard left behind was larger than any legal document. As I watched my son sitting there in silence, I realized this meeting was never really about protecting a house. It was about giving Ethan one final chance to remember the man his father believed he could still become. The weeks following the meeting were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic arguments, no angry phone calls, no attempts to challenge what had been revealed. Instead, there was silence, thoughtful silence, the kind that settles over people when they are forced to confront something they would rather avoid. For a while, I simply returned to my normal routine. I worked in the garden. I met friends for coffee. I spent evenings reading in the living room Richard and I had shared for so many years. Life felt steadier than it had in months. One Saturday afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after the meeting, I heard a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Ethan was standing there alone. He looked different. Not older. Not tired. Just quieter. The confidence that had surrounded him during the house purchase seemed to have disappeared. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he held out a small envelope. I found this in Dad's desk, he said softly. We sat together at the kitchen table while I opened it. Inside was a short note written in Richard's familiar handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. It was clearly written years before his passing. The message itself was brief. Richard had always preferred simple truths over long speeches. The greatest thing we ever build is not a house. It is the people who walk through its doors. If they remember that, the house will never matter. I read the words twice. Then I carefully folded the note, and placed it back inside the envelope. Ethan stared down at the table. I have been thinking about him a lot lately, he said. His voice sounded unsteady, more than I have in years. I listened quietly. There was no need to rush him. When we bought that house, I told myself I was building a future, he continued. But somewhere along the way, I became so focused on protecting it that I stopped protecting the relationships that mattered. The honesty in his words surprised me, not because I doubted he felt regret, because genuine self-reflection is rare, especially when pride has been involved. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. About Richard, about family, about mistakes, about fear. For the first time, Ethan admitted how much financial pressure he and Brooke had been carrying. The failed investments, the debt, the constant worry. None of it excused what happened. But understanding is different from excusing. Sometimes people make poor decisions because they lose sight of what matters most. Before leaving, Ethan asked a question I never expected to hear. Would you come see the house? I looked at him for several seconds. Then I nodded. A week later, I stood in front of the same house where Brooke had once blocked the doorway. The same front porch, the same white shutters, the same door. Yet everything felt different. This time, Ethan opened it before I even reached the steps. He smiled and stepped aside. No speeches, no grand gestures, just a simple invitation. Inside, I noticed something immediately. The photograph above the fireplace had changed. The old arrangement was gone. In its place stood a larger family portrait that included everyone. Richard, me, Ethan, the years we had shared together. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I felt something I had not felt since this entire situation began. Peace. Not because of the house. Not because of the documents. Not because anyone won. The real victory was something far simpler. Richard had spent his life teaching that family was built through gratitude, respect, and memory. For a while, those lessons had been forgotten, but not lost. And as I stood there looking at the photograph above the fireplace, I realized that was the inheritance that mattered most.